Good morning. Welcome to the Point. 44 days. That's when we'll know the outcome of these important elections we've been talking about for over a year. We'll take a look at another one of the candidates in just a moment, but think about this. Absentee ballots started going out yesterday. The first votes will be cast very soon, and we'll know in just over 6 weeks who will be, for example, the next United States Senator for Michigan. Last week, if you were with us, Democratic incumbent Debbie Stabenow was here. Now here is her Republican challenger, John James. Let's start with what has been a pretty eventful week for you. You have been to Washington, D.C. You met with the president and vice president. And in this election cycle, endorsements coming out of the White House have been very important in primaries, particularly. Talk to me about that visit.
Sure. It was, first of all, I don't care who you are. If you get invited to the Oval Office, there's such history. And as a military veteran, I've been taught to respect the office, and it was such an honor to be escorted by the vice president into the Oval Office to meet the president. It was a tremendous honor, and I was actually struck by how good of a listener our president is. He really wanted to know what was going on back here in Michigan. And I told him that we're facing a lot of challenges, among them some of the infrastructure problems that we're seeing all around the state, not just the roads, not just the water and sewer, but also the lack of cyber resources that we have all over the state. You're looking in the next 5 years, 75% of the businesses are going to be in the digital economy, and half our state can't compete. We're talking about those, but also neighborhood by neighborhood issues. I told him that there are kids in Detroit public schools who have to drink out of water bottles because the infrastructure is crumbling within the schools. And he was very happy to hear this, and he asked me what he could do to help. And I believe that by working with anyone in Washington and everyone in Washington to bring resources back to the state of Michigan will benefit everyone regardless of what side of the aisle we're on. So I'm looking forward to working with everybody to make sure that the people of the state of Michigan benefit from the resources from all branches of government.
It's an interesting conversation because we are so keenly aware in Michigan about the infrastructure problems, and not just the stuff above the ground, but the stuff below the ground. We talk about it almost every week on this show. Yet in Washington, there's not been a real infrastructure bill put forward. So, I mean, that's obviously something that in the next session, I would guess a number of people are going to be looking towards. So when you think in terms of what your priorities would be if you were to win and go to Washington, where would you start?
Well, I actually, I'm a little bit of a bias here, but veterans. My first thing would be taking care of our veterans. We have been at war for over a decade and a half. The suicide rate is 22 a day and sustained and has not been going down. We have homelessness and depression that veterans deal with. We still haven't welcomed our Vietnam veterans back properly. There are 670,000 veterans who are not getting the benefits that they've earned through their service. And so I would really focus on making sure we take care of our veterans properly. I would also take a really hard look at healthcare, not just campaigning on it, but getting some work done to make sure that we have market-based, patient-centered preventative approaches where pre-existing conditions are covered, where we make sure that the sickest and most vulnerable among us actually have accommodation from the system, because I truly believe that the people making the choices should be patients and doctors, not the insurance companies and the federal government.
How do you go about that? Does that mean replacing the ACA, dismantling it, or revising it?
It means working with anyone and everyone to make sure that we are considering everyone's point of view, that we're including diversity of thought, that we're coming and we're talking to the subject matter experts, because I would just be one to be representing the people of the state of Michigan, not necessarily any political interest or bias. I would also take a strong look at education. In order to make sure we continue to keep our economy growing, we must take a look at how we're educating people, from early childhood development to K through 12 education to workforce development, to make sure we drive home skilled labor, vocational skills, so everybody can have access to the American dream, criminal justice reform, and making sure that we have a regulatory environment where we can continue to incentivize talent retention here in the state and capital investment back here in the state, so we can continue to grow the economy of the state and continue to grow our economy well.
Talked a little bit about healthcare. I want to go back to the first thing you mentioned, and that is when you talk about taking care of the military. Now, we've heard horror stories about the VA hospitals and some of the services that haven't been provided. We know here in the state that they have struggled with their veterans' homes, and they are making some changes that hopefully will lead to improvements. But from your perspective, what is the thing that needs to be done? Does it need to be done as revamping the VA to better serve the needs of people that you served with and people that have served before you?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have more combat veterans on the floor of the U.S. Senate who actually understand what is at stake and the problem. I actually released some guidelines for how we can go about this, and it's 3 T's. We need to look at talent, we need to look at technology, and we need to look at transition. With the talent, we need to make sure that we continue to reward and retain the best medical talent, staff, counselors, and we broom those bad actors, that minority of folks who are gumming up the system, who are not serving our veterans. We need to make sure that you have best-in-class service for our veterans all over the state and all over the country. The second is technology. We need to take a look at, we avail ourselves of all the resources, telemedicine, that we make sure that we're reducing synergistic effects of pharmaceuticals by making sure that the left hand is talking to the right hand, and veterans understand that they do have access to more resources, that they have a one-stop shop, and they're not just going down dead ends to get their care. We need to increase access to knowledge and access to care. And finally, transition. Going through that transition myself and having so many people go through that transition, there are people who fall through the cracks. The transition of any stage of life is very problematic, and too many people, too many of us, fall through the cracks. The way the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs handle service members in that transition needs to be revamped. We need to take a look at this so it's less of of getting out and now you no longer exist to the DOD, but we recognize that you'll be a civilian twice. We need to make sure that we're continuing to invest in service members so that when they return to the civilian sector, the toughest battle we fight isn't when we get off the battlefield.
One of the things I've heard people talk about is trying to figure out a way to make the skills you learn as a veteran transferable, because you do a lot of things in the military that people in the civilian sector don't necessarily automatically equate as transferable, I mean, from leadership to practical skills, and that's something that the civilian employer needs to know more about.
You're absolutely right, and I made a speech about this a number of years ago in Mackinac about bringing veterans back and getting them into the workforce. You have the hard skills, of course, that you say a truck driver, 18 to 21-year-old truck driver who's driven a truck in a combat zone, and right now under the current regulatory environment in the federal level, an 18 to 21-year-old truck driver can't drive a truck for Meyer from Michigan to Indiana, Michigan to Ohio. Now, of course, if you can trust this young man or woman to carry this payload in a combat zone, we should be able to trust them to drive from Grand Rapids to Columbus. By continuing to address the labor shortage, particularly amongst truckers, particularly getting veterans back to the state of Michigan and getting them working, this is just one simple thing on a federal level that common sense deregulation would help. You also take a look at the fact that you have the soft skills. When you have people who are trained to make life and death decisions in a split second, those are things that you can deploy in any workforce. Being able to work as a member of the team, understanding service before self, understanding that you want to pursue the greater good for the company, the business, or the entity that you're working from. I think that this is part and parcel to what I was talking about of smoothing the transition from the Department of Defense into the Department of Veterans Affairs, making sure that we take a holistic approach to how we're addressing our veterans and their issues.
When you talk about education, and it kind of goes back to this very thing, trying to transfer those skills that you have from the military, but when you think about the civilian population, there are two things. Obviously, our elementary and secondary education programs in the state continue to have trouble. They're struggling to get to reading levels, and that means that those students are going to have trouble that as they try to create their own career. So there's the question of the real education of kids, but there's also the question of developing a future workforce, which would be the same question. What do we do about education if it's not working in Michigan as many think it's not?
Well, we're shooting ourselves in the foot in a lot of regards in terms of education. The first thing, my heart goes out to all of our hardworking teachers who we not only ask to teach our future, but also to be parents in a lot of regards. Because of our crumbling families, we've really set our teachers up for failure. I'm looking forward to doing whatever I can to making sure that we get the most amount of resources to the classroom to facilitate teacher successes. Also, we need to make sure we resource additional counselors, because we have people who are in vulnerable environments who really need additional support in order to really learn and grow and grasp their education and continue to grow. The federal government needs to step up to the plate and keep their promises. And in the U.S. Senate, I'm going to make sure that we do everything to keep our promises. For example, you take a look at the special education, federal special education requirements, vastly underfunded. That's coming out of general funds all over the state, and money is being used in a manner that is not very efficient. We need to make sure that we work together, we bring everyone together, everyone on the federal level keeps their promises. And then we begin to march toward a process where the people in the state and local government determine what's best to educate their children. I believe very, very strongly in making sure that we integrate vocational skills training into the high schools, into the education process, to make sure that when our high schoolers graduate, they have the skills necessary to have meaningful, well-paying careers.
There is the thought that there are so many of these skilled jobs that are available in Michigan right now, and that it will take a long time to fill them, and that number grows exponentially by the estimates of the governor and the administration here in the state of Michigan. But there's also the question that we're still going to need people that go to 4-year and longer colleges. So some of those skilled trades can be taught in a shorter period of time. Others will still want to go to college, but there's a real looming problem. It's not even looming, it's a real problem right now, and that's the cost of that higher education.
Yes.
Is there anything from a federal government level that can be done that would, because most of these are state universities, obviously, not all of them, but is there anything the federal government can do to either help lower cost or somehow participate in that cost?
Well, I think that there are certain practices in terms of the lending practices that you're seeing in the banking industry that really sets our future generations behind the 8 ball. I think that we need to take a comprehensive look at kind of what these colleges are selling and what these financial institutions are selling, and the fact that there is really no way to get that burden of college debt from off of you. Now, I had a different situation. I went to West Point and graduated in 2004. I had tuition that was paid for, but I owed a debt of service to my country in compensation for that. Not everybody has that opportunity, and I'm looking forward to working with everyone, because right now you have a real economic issue that's happening. Because people are paying off college debt until their 40s and 50s, they're not making that initial house purchase. They're continuing to rent. They're the upward pressure to make sure that you have make more of a better living to access the middle class is becoming increasingly more difficult for millennials and younger people to make. We need to make sure that we take the shackles off and allow people to continue to pursue the American dream. And I'm looking forward to working with anyone and everyone who will help lower this burden. Continue to make sure that we increase access to the people in maybe lower socioeconomic rungs who need access to that without breaking them financially.
More of our conversation with Republican candidate for United States Senator John James when we come back. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. At the top of the show, I pointed out we're about 6 weeks away from the election. We'll know the outcome on that day, but between now and then, we'll continue to talk about important races. Another one will feature at the end of this show, so stick around. But now we continue with our conversation with Republican candidate for United States Senate, John James. I want to shift gears a little bit here, and I want to get your thoughts, because you made mention of the more than decade-long war that we have been involved in. You were there firsthand, and while there is nobody that understands everything that plays into our international relationships, where are we, from your perspective as somebody who has been in combat, when we are dealing with the countries of the Middle East, when we are working with South and now North Korea? The perspective that you would take to Washington on that, because, as I say, you've seen it firsthand, certainly in the Middle East.
The world is increasingly complex as it is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The world is becoming a more and more dangerous place, and we need somebody who understands national security from a strategic to a tactical standpoint, who understands how to connect all these dots, understanding that Chinese incursion into the South China Sea and their influence over North Korea and what they are doing and not doing vitally threatens our national security, but not just from a land, sea, and air standpoint, but also from a cyber and space standpoint. You take a look at what Russia is doing by enabling Iran, saying things like death to America and death to Israel, and as Iran continues to fund sources like Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthi rebels, as they continue to destabilize the Middle East, what we're seeing is the increasing communist spheres of influence that are threatening peace around the world. And we can't take our eyes off the ball when it comes to South America and also Africa, because when you have vacuums of power, nature abhors a vacuum, and they create breeding grounds for chaos, for drug lords, for ISIS, for terrorist organizations. And we need to make sure that we have someone on the floor of the U.S. Senate who recognizes the dangers that are posed outside, someone who's been outside of the gates and who recognizes how good we have it in the United States of America and how we take care of that. A great way to do that is making sure that our service members are properly funded, to make sure that we give consistency, and rather than continuing resolution to continuing resolution, we give more consistency so that we can have better purchasing power and have more consistency with how the Pentagon does business. I support what General Mattis said when he wants to increase the force lethality of our military. He wants to strengthen our strategic partnerships with our allies and intelligence agencies all over the world. And we have to make sure we run the Pentagon more like a business, being more effective in efficiency with the resources and treasure that we, the people, have given the federal government to keep us safe and to keep us free. Being a businessman and a former combat veteran, I'm in a very well-positioned place to make sure that we can do all of that, to decrease fraud, waste, and abuse, but also to make sure the people on our front lines, our brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, have the resources they need to keep us safe.
Chaos in South America creates another interesting dilemma for the United States as people push up through South America, in through Central America to Mexico, and it brings us to our southern border. Now, the president, who has endorsed you, has talked a lot about a wall. We know that there's a lot of pushback on that in Washington, but in general, what should we be doing in terms of our immigration policies, and what should we be doing about people who come here outside of the law that governs those policies?
I believe the strongest wall are close friends and neighbors. I believe the best thing we can do to keep ourselves safe is to make sure that we have strong relationships with Mexico and Canada. I believe that we have mutual interests when it comes to keeping North America free and safe and continuing our economic growth without forfeiting our national security. I believe very, very strongly that we need to secure our borders, that we need to defund sanctuary cities, but we also need to make sure that we continue to make sure that we're doing the right thing the right way. That means working with our partners in North America, but also all around the world, to make sure that we combat terrorism right under our umbrella. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, we basically took ownership for everything within our hemisphere for national security reasons, because we didn't want foreign powers to get under our umbrella to threaten our way of life. I think that obligation still holds, and we need to make sure that we're doing everything to work with our neighbors and our allies to make sure that we keep America safe first, but working with our friends and our neighbors and our allies in Mexico and Canada as partners to make sure that we continue to grow our economy without forfeiting our national security.
We've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk to you about the state of the race, because you and I were talking just before we sat down. You've been at this for a year, almost to the date, and you've talked about it being a sprint from the very first day. Obviously, running against a three-term incumbent U.S. Senator is a hill to climb. Mm-hmm. So tell me where you think this race is. We've seen numbers. We know what some of the polling says about 6.5 weeks out. So where do you think this race is, and what do you know about this process that you didn't know 12 months ago?
Well, I'll tell you, I became a candidate on this day exactly last year. And I've learned a tremendous amount, but mostly how diverse and how big this state is. Grand Rapids and Detroit are nowhere near the same. Sault Ste. Marie and Alpena are nowhere near the same. And being able to actually go out there and meet people and shake their hands, you can't hide behind social media or hide behind TV and win anymore. Authenticity is rewarded in the state of Michigan. This is the same state that, yes, Donald Trump won, but so did Bernie, because people recognize that career politicians have failed us. And Debbie Stabenow has been in office for 43 years. She's been in Washington for 20, and she's been in the Senate for 18. What has she shown us to display that she's going to do anything more effectively over the next 6 years that she's failed to do in the past 18? I think that people are ready for a change. I think they're ready for somebody who has a passion for service, a clear vision for the future, and someone who has proven energetic leadership experience in the toughest of environments, bringing all of my aircraft and all of my men back home from Iraq, but also growing a family business coming out of the Great Recession in Detroit. These are the skill sets, understanding national security, but also understanding how to grow an economy and grow jobs, that we need on the floor of the U.S. Senate. We used to send statesmen to represent the people, and now increasingly you have a political elite that represent the coast and not the best interests of the state of Michigan. We now have someone who has made promises to fix our educational system in the year 2000 by 2010, and we have one of the worst educational systems here in Michigan of anywhere in the world. We had somebody in Senator Stabenow who made promises to fix pharmaceuticals back in 2002. Since then has collected $400,000 from special interests and lobbyists and still hasn't fixed the problem. You have somebody, Senator Stabenow, who promised to fix the Sioux locks. The Sioux locks are still crumbling. We need to repair the Sioux locks, but also get another lock to make sure that we don't shut down our economy in the state of Michigan and have jobless claims skyrocket. Good intentions are not good enough. Senator Stabenow is all talk. It's time for a change. The establishment has not served, of either party. Both political parties have failed the American people. Both political parties have failed the people of the state of Michigan. And I'm looking forward to working with everybody, because quite frankly, we need leadership on the floor of the U.S. Senate, not more lawyers, not more career politicians. We need results out of Washington.
Now, if you'd like to compare and contrast what Mr. James had to say versus Senator Stabenow, you can catch that show at woodtv.com. In fact, you can catch all of our To The Point programs at our website. We'll be back with more To The Point. In this election cycle, there are a lot of important choices to make. U.S. Senate, U.S. House, State Senate. But one of the races we've watched most closely is the race for governor. This week, I caught up with the Republican and Democratic candidates. Gretchen Whitmer and Bill Schuette are both in a sprint to the finish of what has been more than a year of campaigning. Whitmer has been leading in the polls. Schuette has 44 days to try and change that. The two don't agree on much, including how they characterize the other's positions.
Former Senator Whitmer's answer for everything is to raise taxes.
Bill Schuette rarely misses an opportunity to talk about taxes when he discusses his opponent. You've heard the Attorney General say that you want to raise taxes, that that's your agenda, that you want to raise taxes. So when you hear that, what do you think?
I think the Attorney General should stop talking about me and offer something that's an alternative. That's exactly what I'm running on. I am so sick and tired of politicians who just give us words, statements, not real plans. We got to get things done in this state.
For her part, Gretchen Whitmer insists that Schuette would do away with the government-provided health care program called Healthy Michigan.
One of us brokered Medicaid expansion. The other's been trying to undo it.
Senator Whitmer's campaign says you would do away with that. What would you do with it?
Well, it's just such nonsense. And the fact is, Healthy Michigan is the law. And it's not going anywhere. We need to have affordable, accessible health care. And I've always said that we need to make sure we cover pre-existing conditions, cover your children until they're 26, and have portability of insurance across state lines. So,
from now until Election Day, the two will continue to draw contrast between their positions, but on one point they do agree, and that is that there is a clear difference.
And it's a contrast between the extreme agenda of former Senator Whitmer and Garland Gilchrist.
This is a stark choice in this election, and it's not just about us today. This is about the next few decades.
So here's a quick program note. We're preempted next week, but we'll be back October 7th. We'll introduce you to the Republican and Democratic candidates for Secretary of State. And the following week, we will recap the first major televised debate between the Republican and Democratic candidates for governor that will be held right here at Wood TV. This is an important election cycle. I hope we'll see you every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for To The Point.